So I'm going to be describing the path that the Fish and Wildlife Service has taken to better describe the benefits and risks of our Pacific Region National Fish Hatcheries. And I'm also going to talk to the need for us to continue on this path to implement the science of hatchery reform. But before I do that, I'm going to take a step back and ask a show of hands on people that remember the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 30 years ago. Yeah, good. So you probably also remember this person that stood out exploring what went wrong, and he's the renowned scientist Richard Feynman. He's a brilliant man, known for his humor and wit, and he was known to simply describe complexities. So I'm going to read a passage from one of his published lectures where he spoke to the topic, what is science? This is a great book, by the way. So the meaning of it all. So it's my Bible. Yeah. So what is science? The word is usually used to mean one of three things or a mixture of them. I do not think we need to be precise. It's not always a good idea to be too precise. Sometimes science means a special method of finding things out. Sometimes it means the body of knowledge arising from the things found out. And it may also mean the new things you can do when you have found something out, or the actual doing of new things. The most obvious characteristic of science is its application, the fact that as a consequence of science, one has a power to do things. Stepping down rocket science to hatchery reform. The practice of hatchery reform has been defined by our own renowned scientist, Dr. Donald Campton. And he has said, hatchery reform is actually quite simple in principle. It's managing hatcheries as a type of habitat, managing fish as components of viable populations, and managing populations, both hatchery and wild, for maximum viability. So on to the Pacific Region Hatchery Reviews. So we as the Fish and Wildlife Service conducted an internal review of our hatchery programs, looking at 4 geographic regions: the Olympic Peninsula, Lower Columbia, Mid-Columbia, and Lower Snake River areas. We reviewed 24 federal hatchery programs, 24 federal hatcheries, 53 programs, making approximately 750 recommendations. The hatchery review team published our reports from 2006 through 2011, and then we also published a region-wide recommendations report for our hatcheries in 2013. All of these reports are available on the Pacific Region website, as seen at the bottom of the screen there. So for our hatchery review, we adopted 3 guiding principles from the Hatchery Science Review Group, and they published their principles in 2005 for the Western Washington Puget Sound region, and in 2011 for the Columbia River region. So those 3 guiding principles are: we need to have well-defined goals for our hatchery programs, quantifying desired benefits for harvest and or conservation, as well as research, education, and outreach. Our programs must be scientifically defensible. We must have measured benefits and risks for our programs, protocols, and methods, and we need to respond to new information, making sure that we're incorporating monitoring and evaluation into management practices. We reviewed the following operational components for our hatchery review: from incubation, rearing, release out migration, facilities, education, and outreach. And to keep this presentation within 15 minutes, I'm going to focus on the broader goals and the adult fish management and the need for incorporating monitoring and evaluation into management. First up, I'm going to speak to the topic of adult fish management and the integrated broodstock management strategy. I'm going to use Warm Springs National Fish Hatchery as an example, where there we work in cooperation with the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Reservation of Oregon, and we do our best to identify both harvest and conservation goals. So to provide a little more background on this hatchery program, in 1978, the program utilized wild spring Chinook salmon passing the hatchery site. And since that time, depending on the strength of the wild return, wild fish are integrated into the hatchery brood, and we also limit the number of hatchery fish passing upstream. So findings from a recent published evaluation by Christian Smith and David Hand, as well as co-authors from the state of Oregon and the Warm Springs tribe, they found that restricting hatchery fish on spawning grounds has been more successful than regularly incorporating wild fish into the broodstock. However, they did also find that the genetic integrity of the Warm Springs River population has been maintained since 1978. So again, the integrated broodstock program, where natural populations are actually driving the program. Now to speak to a segregated broodstock management program, I'm going to use example from the Columbia River Gorge and the Fall Chinook programs at Spring Creek National Fish Hatchery, seen on your left, and Little White Salmon National Fish Hatchery, the picture on your right. So hatchery production of Thule Fall Chinook salmon started over 100 years ago, collecting broodstock from the Little White Salmon and White Salmon rivers. And Thule Fall Chinook salmon are currently being reared at Spring Creek National Fish Hatchery. Then the adult fish for Little White Salmon National Fish Hatchery are termed the upriver bright stock of Fall Chinook. And these were fish collected at Bonneville Dam and mid-Columbia River hatcheries in the late 70s and early 80s. The purpose of these programs were to enhance harvest and to mitigate for lost production from construction operation of Bonneville, the Dalles, and John Day dams. For a segregated program, hatchery fish are spawned with hatchery fish, and hatchery populations are segregated from natural production. Okay, now I'm going to speak some more to program goals for adult fish. Recently, parties of the USV-Oregon Agreement have agreed to Fall Chinook salmon goals in terms of total adult production, and that's for mitigation for John Day and the Dalles dams. And the USV-Oregon parties found that the lost production from John Day, the Dalles dam, was 107,000 adult fish. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to share with you the total adult production objectives and harvest benefits that we expect specifically from these two hatcheries. And then I'm going to follow it up with some observations of hatchery fish on the spawning grounds from these programs. Based on a 15-year agreed period, the USV-Oregon parties identified total adult production of approximately 14,000 adult salmon from a release of 4.5 million smolts from Little White Salmon National Fish Hatchery. The harvest benefit from this program is anticipated to be an annual number of 5,900 salmon distributed in fisheries from Alaska down through the Columbia River. And then for an order of magnitude larger, looking at the Fall Chinook program at Spring Creek Hatchery, we have a total adult production goal of 49,500 fish from a release of 10.5 million smolts, average anticipated annual harvest benefit of 28,000 salmon. So as part of the total adult production picture, we also need to consider the number of hatchery fish recovered on spawning grounds. Generally speaking, the percent homing back to our hatcheries is high, but because of the sheer number of fish returning to these facilities and during particularly high survival years, there can be a lot of fish recovered from our hatchery programs in nearby streams. Other factors can also affect homing and straying, including hatchery operations, river conditions, and hydro operations at dam, and things like federal furloughs that affect staffing level and operating our facilities. And that you can see is part of the effect in the high number of strays from the Little White Salmon program brood year 2009. So, findings from a recent published evaluation by Christian Smith and Rod Engel, and they looked at the interbreeding between the Thule fall Chinook salmon, which are an ESA-listed stock, and the upriver bright fall Chinook salmon produced at Little White, which are not listed. And they looked at the spawning and interaction of these fish in the White Salmon River. They found that the genetic concern for interbreeding is low, although there's some ecological concern of the upriver bright fish potentially digging up the spawning nests of the earlier spawning Thule stock. And there's also a potential high degree of gene flow from the hatchery to the wild natural spawning areas, particularly in some years as seen in the graph. The main point is monitoring and evaluation can help evaluate the balance of looking at the benefits for this program for harvest, and the risk in this program is potentially too many fish from a segregated hatchery program on spawning grounds. So jumping from the salmon and steelhead program for hatchery reform, we also need to think beyond salmon and steelhead on operation of our programs. In 2014, we completed an assessment looking at passage of Pacific lamprey and bull trout past Warm Springs Hatchery. And there the researchers found that passage problems for bull trout were less significant than for Pacific lamprey. And with discussions with the Warm Springs tribe, they're working on designing construction of an adult lamprey passage ramp, as seen on the graphic at the right. And that's at a much smaller scale as what's already you can find at Bonneville Dam on the Columbia River and at 3 Mile Dam on the Umatilla. But like I said, a much smaller scale. And then within the Pacific region, there's also a need for more research with conservation hatchery programs. And some work that our office has been doing recently is on the experimental rearing of bull trout and Pacific lamprey, with the results of this work being input into a structured decision model to help inform managers for future conservation actions. The Fish and Wildlife Service Strategic Habitat Conservation Model can be used for all population, be they birds or fish. The key is that populations are the driver for both habitat and hatchery management. Assumption-driven research and monitoring and evaluation are critical for feeding into the model to determine predictive outcomes. And using this model, implementing the science of hatchery reform is strategic hatchery management. Thank you.
We looking good?
Doug, do you think the service is going to develop a roll-up report of what's been implemented from the reviews that were completed? I can't think of when the last review was completed, but I know the 2013 basin-wide report was there. So do you see that coming in the future from the service?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent idea, and I really hope that would come out, and so we can be real transparent with our partners and the public and what we're doing. The last time the service evaluated the implementation of all the recommendations was back in 2010, so 5 years ago. So it's timely that we take a look at it again to report back to the public and what kind of progress we're making.
Anybody else? One from the back?
Doug, yeah, I think you said there were something like 750 recommendations that were made, and I'm wondering if you have a sense of any kind of follow-up on how many of those recommendations have been implemented and if they're useful and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, many of the recommendations were implemented before we even completed our reviews. But I think in the last assessment, I think it was a little over half of the recommendations have been implemented. Another 25% managers report they're in progress of working on it, and another quarter haven't been worked on. That was 2010.